Ronan Gallagher had spent 33 years watching people flinch when he walked into a room. Boston knew his name the way it knew winter, something you brace for, something you don't argue with. Men twice his age lowered their eyes at his table, and the whole harbor went quiet when his car rolled in. He'd buried a father, he'd inherited an empire built in shadow, and he was certain he'd already seen every kind of look a human face could give him. Fear, greed, hatred, the desperate smile of someone begging for one more week. So when his little sister Bridget begged him for a solid month to show up to one lunch, one ordinary blind date in the middle of the afternoon, at a quiet restaurant called the Larkspur, he agreed mostly to make her stop calling. He straightened his jacket, chose the chair with its back to the wall out of old habit, watched the gray rain sliding down the tall windows, and told himself this was just an afternoon he'd never think about again. He wasn't ready for the woman who came through that door. Her name was Tessa, with her chestnut hair tucked behind one ear and gray eyes that had clearly learned to read a room faster than most people learn to lie. She was beautiful in a worn, honest way, the kind of beauty that survived something, and she was in a wheelchair. She stopped a short distance from his table, folded her hands in her lap, and instead of hello, she said the thing she'd taught herself to say first, before anyone's smile could curdle, before the pity or the polite excuse to leave. "I'm sorry. Bridget probably didn't tell you. I'm in a wheelchair. If you'd rather not stay, I won't hold it against you. I promise," she said it steadily. But her eyes were already braced for the sound she'd heard more times than she could count, the soft click of a door closing that never makes any noise at all. What this dangerous man did in the next 10 seconds was something no one in that city would have believed. And it would end up rewriting everything the two of them thought they knew about mercy, about what a person is worth, and about who's really the strong one. If this story touches something in you, take a second to like this video, share it with someone who needs the reminder today, and subscribe for more stories like this one. Now let's go back to that cold, rainy Friday afternoon at the Larkspur, and the 10 seconds that changed two broken lives forever. 10 seconds. In Ronan Gallagher's world, 10 seconds were enough time for a single decision to change the course of someone's life, and he used those 10 seconds in a way no one in this city could have ever imagined. He didn't answer what she'd just said. He didn't offer a reassuring smile. He didn't shake his head in denial. He didn't reach for any of the hurried words of comfort she'd heard so many times she could have recited them from memory, those kind-sounding promises spoken only to fill the silence before a man found an excuse to walk away. Instead, his gaze lowered, not to her legs, not to the wheelchair as though it were the sum of everything pitiful about her. It settled on one tiny detail, the right front wheel, where the bolt holding the caster fork had worked itself loose some time ago. She'd been hiding it ever since by leaning slightly to the left whenever she moved, such a small habit that even she believed no one in the world had ever noticed it. He rose to his feet. Tessa felt her chest tighten, because she knew this sequence by heart. She'd watched it happen so many times she could have predicted every movement. They stood up. They pretended to check their phones. They said something urgent had come up. Then the door closed softly behind them, as though no one had ever been sitting there first place. But this man didn't walk toward the door. He stepped around the edge of the table without the slightest hurry. He bent down until he was level with her eyes, as though he were only reaching for a dropped napkin. Then, with a movement so smooth that the diners at the next table didn't even bother looking up, he lowered one knee to the floor beside her wheel. Tessa stopped breathing. She watched his hands, large hands marked with the calluses of someone who'd spent years doing hard work, reach directly for that loose bolt without a second of hesitation. He didn't search for it. He didn't ask where it was. His fingers simply found it, as though they'd touched this kind of joint hundreds of times before, as though they already knew exactly what they were going to find. He turned it gently, then tested the play in the caster fork with 2 fingers, displaying a strange ease that had no business existing in a man dressed in an expensive suit inside an elegant restaurant, a familiarity that simply couldn't belong to someone who'd never lived alongside a wheelchair. Then he looked up at her, his voice low, even, and calm, as though they were discussing nothing more important than the weather. "The bolt on your right front caster is loose. Tightening it by hand will only hold for a few days. It needs the right size wrench. After we're done eating, I'll tighten it properly. I've got the tools in my car." He stood, brushed a little dust from one knee, returned to his seat as though he'd just done the most ordinary thing in the world, pulled the menu closer, and let his eyes drift across it. Right now, though, I need your help with something more important. People keep saying the beef stew here is the best in this neighborhood, but I've never trusted rumors. Will you have dinner with me and help me find out? Tessa sat frozen. She'd prepared herself for pity. She'd prepared herself for awkwardness. She'd even prepared herself for the worst case, that this man would pretend to answer a phone call and disappear through those glass doors. She'd prepared herself for everything except what had just happened. He hadn't asked why she used a wheelchair. He hadn't told her it didn't matter, because saying those words would have meant admitting it was supposed to matter in the first place. He hadn't turned the wheelchair into an obstacle she had to overcome, or a sorrow that needed comforting. He'd only seen a loose bolt, one small inconvenience in another person's life, and dealt with it as naturally as someone picking up a glove another person had dropped. In that moment, something that had been frozen inside Tessa's chest for a very long time developed the faintest crack. It began at the corner of her mouth, trembling ever so slightly before breaking into laughter she couldn't stop. Laughter so clear and genuine that even she startled at the sound, a sound she'd believed she'd left behind in another lifetime, the life she'd lived before the rain that had fallen so many years ago. She laughed until her eyes curved with it, and the most dangerous man in Boston simply sat there watching her laugh. He didn't rush her. He didn't ask questions. He waited with the quiet patience of a harbor waiting for its ship to come home. "Are you serious?" she finally asked, her breathing still shaking with the last traces of laughter. "About the bolt or about the beef stew?" "Both. I've never been more serious," he replied. For the first time that afternoon, something almost imperceptible softened at the corner of the man with the dark bottle-green eyes, something none of the people who trembled before him down at the harbor would have ever believed existed. Beyond the tall glass windows, the rain still fell beneath a sky washed completely gray, but at the little corner table inside that quiet restaurant on that afternoon, a woman had just realized that the door she'd spent years waiting to hear close behind her hadn't closed this time. And a man had just found himself wondering why the heart that had always been as silent as a steel vault had suddenly missed a beat because of nothing more than a single laugh. What Tessa didn't know, what she wouldn't understand until much later, was that those hands hadn't become that skilled by accident, and that this afternoon, which seemed so completely unexpected, had actually begun long before this moment, in a place she'd never have imagined. That night, after the loose bolt on the front caster had been tightened by the hands of a man she'd known for less than an afternoon, Tessa returned to the place she called home. A ground-floor apartment tucked away on an old street in South Boston, where the screech of the train passing each night made the window panes tremble, and the damp scent of century-old brick walls had seeped into her dreams themselves. The apartment was so small that even turning her wheelchair required careful planning, but it was on the ground floor, with no stairs and no broken elevator, and to her that alone was a blessing worth holding onto with everything she had. She switched on the only desk lamp that still worked properly and wheeled herself to the drawing table beside the window, where unfinished illustrations were waiting for her. Rabbits wearing knitted hats, clouds with smiling faces, gardens where every pathway was wide and level, the gentle world she painted for children's books, a world that her own life had never allowed her to live inside. The deadline was tomorrow morning. Micah's tuition for the next semester was due next week. Those two facts didn't need to be written anywhere. They'd already been carved into her mind as deeply as words chiseled into stone. She painted. The hands of the clock crawled past midnight, then kept moving into the hours when the entire street had gone dark, leaving only her desk lamp casting its tiny circle of golden light across the page, like a lonely island floating in a sea of darkness. Then the familiar pain came. It began in the joint of her thumb, spread across her palm, then slowly tightened around her wrist like an invisible rope. Someone was pulling a little tighter with every passing moment. The fingers holding her brush gradually stiffened. They trembled. They stopped obeying her. Tessa laid the brush down. She didn't sigh. She didn't wince. She simply turned her wheelchair toward the left, where she'd placed a basin of cold water earlier that evening, a ritual that had become such a habit she performed it without thinking. She lowered her entire right hand into the freezing water. The cold bit into her flesh like thousands of tiny needles, and she counted silently inside her head. Not numbers, only breaths. 1 breath in, 1 breath out. She kept counting until the icy sting numbed the pain, until the fingers beneath the water were no longer fingers crying out in agony, but only fingers that had finally fallen silent. The cold water couldn't heal anything. She knew that better than anyone. She'd once stood on the other side of that knowledge. She'd once been the person telling patients not to do things like this. But muscle relaxants were expensive, and if these hands stopped drawing for even one night, her younger brother would come up short. Between her own pain and her brother's future, she'd made her choice long ago. She'd chosen without needing to think, the way people chose to breathe. She lifted her hand from the basin, dried it with the towel she'd draped over the arm of her wheelchair, rubbed it gently until the blood began flowing again, then picked up her brush and continued painting. The rabbit wearing the knitted hat smiled once more from the page, as though nothing at all had happened beneath that small pool of yellow light. While she waited for one layer of color to dry, her eyes drifted absent-mindedly toward the window, where the streetlights filtered through the last traces of the night's rain. Somehow, the image of the man's hands that afternoon returned to her. Those fingers had found the loose bolt without a second of searching, moving with such remarkable familiarity. That ease lingered in her thoughts like a single note out of place in an otherwise perfect melody, and it stirred something inside the memory of a woman who'd once spent her life keeping others alive. Without warning, her mind wandered back to a brilliant white hospital corridor from years ago, back when these hands hadn't held paintbrushes but the instruments that pulled people back from the edge of darkness. There was one shift she'd never truly forgotten. She'd only put it away. A young woman had been rushed into the emergency room, with her life hanging by the thinnest thread, her face pale beneath the harsh lights overhead. Tessa had remained beside her through the longest hours she'd ever known, her hands never trembling even once, holding on to that stranger's life with everything she'd learned, and with everything no textbook could ever teach. She remembered the moment the monitors began to recover. She remembered someone behind her whispering that it was a miracle. But she'd never known what became of that young woman afterward, where she'd gone when she woke, or what kind of life she'd gone on to live. Back then, that was the nature of her profession. You saved a life, then let go and watched it drift back toward its own future, like setting a lantern upon a river in the middle of the night. Tessa gave a faint shake of her head and brought herself back to the present, back to the page before her, and tomorrow morning's deadline. She didn't know why that memory had chosen this particular night to return after lying silent for so many years. She certainly couldn't have known that the lantern she'd once released onto that river had never drifted away at all, that it had quietly turned against the current and found its way back to her, and that this rainy afternoon at the Larkspur had been the very first glimmer of its light reaching her once again. She simply lowered her head and finished drawing the rabbit's smile, while somewhere else in the city, inside an office overlooking the dark harbor, a man was still awake, his fingers moving slowly across the beads tattooed around his wrist, thinking about the sound of a woman's laughter. Morning at the ground-by-floor apartment, on pale light the color of milk filtering through the old curtains, accompanied by the familiar clatter from the tiny kitchen, where Micah stood in front of the stove with a frying pan in his hands, his tousled brown hair exactly like their mother's had once been. His lanky frame, that of a 19-year-old young man who still hadn't quite grown accustomed to the length of his own arms and legs. He cooked eggs the only way he knew how. The heat was a little too high. The salt was always a little too generous. The edges of the eggs always browned into a thin burnt rim. Tessa had never once corrected the way he made them, because that charred little edge tasted exactly like the eggs their father used to make on Sunday mornings from a lifetime that now felt impossibly far away. And there are certain imperfections in this world that deserve to remain untouched because they're all that's left of the people we miss. Hearing the soft roll of her wheelchair through the kitchen doorway, Micah turned around, his face immediately lighting up with the kind of smile that held no calculation at all. The kind only people with truly unburdened hearts managed to keep after everything life had thrown at them. "You're up, Tessa. I already made yours. Today's eggs are only a little burnt. I'd say that's some serious progress." He placed the plate on the table, poured a glass of orange juice, pulled out his own chair, everything with the quick, efficient movements of a first-year engineering student who'd grown used to taking apart and rebuilding almost anything. Then, just as he lifted his first forkful of eggs, he glanced toward the window, where the autumn sunlight spread a gentle golden glow across the sidewalk outside. His eyes sparkled with clear excitement as he asked the question that sometimes found its way back on beautiful mornings like this. "Tessa, it's such a nice day today. How about I push you out to Franklin Park for a stroll? It's been forever since we visited. I was just thinking about the old days when we used to run there, and how you'd always beat me on the last hill. I promise I won't try to race your wheels this time." The little kitchen fell silent for half a heartbeat. Only half a heartbeat, so brief that no one outside their lives would have ever noticed it. It was the kind of silence Tessa had learned to fill with every ounce of gentleness she possessed. She looked at her younger brother. She looked into those hopeful eyes, the eyes of the little boy she'd carried in her arms when he was still a newborn, whose hand she'd held crossing streets after their parents died, whose bedside she'd never left through nights of dangerous fevers. Then she smiled, a smile without the faintest crack. "I'm a little tired today, Micah. Tomorrow, okay? Tomorrow it is." He nodded without hesitation. "Tomorrow's fine. But you promised." Then he turned back to his eggs, chatting happily about the project he was still working on, about his demanding professor, about all the countless little things that filled the life of a 19-year-old whose future still stretched wide open before him, as innocent as though that single word "tomorrow" were a promise that truly existed. Back then, the doctors had explained everything to Tessa in the precise medical language she understood all too well. The trauma had left uneven gaps in her brother's memory, like a book with random pages torn away. Some of his recent memories would disappear without warning, while much older ones remained perfectly intact. They'd told the family to accept it gently, never correct him, never force him to remember. She'd followed that advice all these years. She'd answered questions about those morning runs more times than she could possibly count, always with exactly the same smile and exactly the same word. Tomorrow, the gentlest lie in the world, the cruelest lie in the world. A tomorrow she'd keep offering for as long as her brother kept asking. She'd never cried in front of Micah because of that question. If tears came, she saved them for the moments when she was alone behind the bathroom door, turning on the faucet so the running water would drown out every sound. But this morning, after Micah had slung his backpack over one shoulder, reminded her to finish all her eggs, and made it halfway to the front door, he suddenly stopped. He didn't completely turn around. He simply stood there for a brief moment, one hand resting on the doorknob. In the slightly tilted mirror hanging by the entrance, Tessa caught a fleeting glimpse of her brother's eyes. They no longer held the bright eagerness they'd shown over breakfast. They were quiet now, deep as the still surface of a well. Eyes that somehow seemed to see far more than his words ever revealed, as though they knew something that even he himself was afraid to touch. The moment passed so quickly, she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. Then Micah opened the door, called back in his usual cheerful voice that he'd be home late because of a group meeting, and the door closed softly behind him. Tessa remained alone in the kitchen, still carrying the scent of eggs with their familiar burnt edges. She stared at the two plates on the table, one completely empty, the other untouched, and she sat there for a very long time, her right hand gently rubbing the aching joints that still throbbed from the night before, never knowing that on the other side of the city, a man had just asked his younger sister one very simple question about what kind of flowers that woman liked, and that his sister had remained silent for quite a while before answering. Because Bridget Gallagher was carrying inside her heart a secret greater than every bouquet of flowers in the world. On the very same morning, Micah slung his backpack over one shoulder and left the ground floor apartment on the eastern edge of the city, while the frost still clung to the towering stacks of shipping containers. The entire harbor already knew their boss was on his way down. No one announced it. No siren sounded. But news like that traveled faster than the sea wind in a place like this, and people recognized it through the smallest signs. The dock workers suddenly became quieter. The conversations around the coffee machine died away on their own. Even the long row of cranes seemed to slow their movements by a single beat as the black sedan without license plates rolled through the main gate. Ronan Gallagher stepped out of the car wearing a dark wool coat. There were no bodyguards shadowing him. He didn't need them. In this kingdom, what protected him wasn't guns or armed men, but something far simpler and far more absolute. Everyone knew exactly who he was, and everyone knew exactly what he was capable of. People had called this the territory of the Gallagher family for 3 generations, ever since his grandfather laid the first stone in the shadows. Under Ronan's rule, that kingdom operated according to 3 principles. Every person who worked for him knew by heart as though reciting a prayer. Never touch the white powder that slowly destroys human lives. Never lay a hand on women or children. Never forget a debt of gratitude. Anyone who honored those 3 rules received his protection. Anyone who broke them would discover there wasn't a corner in this city dark enough to hide. This morning, he'd come to the docks because one man had forgotten. Inside a small operations office overlooking the pier stood a middle-aged man named Sullivan. His broad hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles had turned white. He'd worked for the Gallagher family since Ronan's father's time, but over the past several weeks he'd secretly sold shipping schedules to an outside broker in exchange for thick envelopes filled with cash. The evidence rested neatly inside a thin file that Connor Byrne, the salt and pepper-haired man standing silently by the door with an expression carved from stone, had already placed on the desk. Ronan didn't sit down. He stood beside the window overlooking the gray sea, his back turned toward the trader, throughout a silence so long it became difficult to breathe. He didn't utter a single word, allowing that silence to finish the work on its own, because he'd learned long ago that, for people who already knew they were guilty, there was no punishment heavier than waiting for the punishment to arrive. At last he spoke, his voice no louder than someone asking for the time of day, and it was precisely that calmness that seemed to lower the temperature inside the room. "Sullivan, my father trusted you. I kept you because of that trust. The moment you accepted money from outsiders, you betrayed both of us, the living man and the dead one." Sullivan collapsed into the chair as though every bone had been pulled from his body. His lips trembled uncontrollably as broken apologies stumbled out one after another, and among those shattered words came a single plea. He'd fallen into debt. He had a young child still in school. Ronan finally turned around. He studied the traitor for a long time, and everyone present in that room would later say that was the most terrifying moment of all. Not because of any anger, but because no one could read a single emotion behind those dark bottle green eyes. Then he spoke, slowly, every word perfectly clear. "Your child didn't choose who his father would be. He doesn't pay this debt. You'll leave this city before the weekend. Take your family with you, and don't ever let me hear your name again. That's the only mercy I have, and I only give it once." 2 men helped Sullivan out of the room because his legs could no longer carry his weight. As he left, he repeated words of gratitude over and over like a desperate prayer, and the door closed softly behind him, leaving only 2 men inside. Connor poured 2 cups of black coffee, placed one beside the file, and said in the even voice of someone who'd witnessed too many mornings like this that old Sullivan had been fortunate, because under Ronan's father, the ending would have been very different. Ronan didn't answer. He simply looked down at the harbor, where containers rose and descended with perfect rhythm, before asking a question that had nothing whatsoever to do with business. If someone spends his whole life living in the darkness, can he ever get used to the light again? Connor paused for a single second at the unexpected question. Before he could answer, the phone inside his coat pocket vibrated. He glanced at the screen, and something flickered across the face of the salt and pepper-haired man, whose expression was normally as still as stone. It was only the faintest tightening of his jaw, so slight it was almost impossible to notice. He excused himself to take the call outside, his voice remaining calm, even though his footsteps were just half a beat quicker than usual. Through the frosted glass wall, Ronan watched the silhouette of his right-hand man standing with his back turned, his head slightly lowered. The conversation didn't last long, but when Connor returned, he slipped the phone into the inside pocket of his coat, instead of the outside pocket where he always kept it, such an insignificant detail that no one gave it a second thought, not even Ronan himself, because his mind was tangled somewhere else entirely, somewhere filled with the clear laughter of a woman in a wheelchair, and the question he'd texted Bridget earlier that morning, a question his sister still hadn't answered. A question so disarmingly simple, it seemed almost ridiculous coming from the man standing at the top of an empire. What kind of flowers did she like? That afternoon, after Tessa had delivered her completed illustrations and was making her way home along the narrow street leading to her apartment, she noticed an unfamiliar car parked near the curb cut that led onto the sidewalk. It was far too polished and expensive for a neighborhood of weathered brick buildings and peeling wooden fences. Leaning casually against its side was a man in a leather jacket, carrying himself with the confidence of someone who'd spent his entire life making other people wait rather than waiting for anyone himself. He spotted her from a distance. Without the slightest hurry, he pushed himself away from the car and walked forward until he blocked the narrow path completely, positioning himself so her wheelchair couldn't pass on either side. It was a petty calculation, but she understood it immediately, because men like him always knew how to use the landscape to begin a conversation, long before they ever opened their mouths. "Miss Monroe." "Right?" he asked, without really asking at all, his voice as light as though he were greeting an old acquaintance. "I'm here on behalf of the people who now own your hospital debt. I'm sure you remember it. The hospital sold that account to our company a long time ago. My boss is a very patient man, but every kind of patience has its limit." Tessa stopped a comfortable distance away, both hands resting quietly on the rims of her wheels. She lifted her eyes and met the man's gaze directly. She didn't look away. She didn't lower her eyes. Life had taught her over the past 4 years that with men like this, fear was the only currency they truly wanted to collect, and she had no intention of paying them with it. "I've transferred the agreed payment every month exactly according to the original arrangement," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I've never missed a single payment." The man gave a dry little laugh. He reached into his inner pocket, pulled out a sheet of paper folded into quarters, and deliberately let it fall into her lap with careless precision. "The old agreement isn't valid anymore. New owner, new rules. Mr. Doyle just bought the entire debt portfolio from the previous company, and he doesn't care for people paying little by little until the end of their lives. New amount, new deadline, everything's in there. You've got until the end of the month." The name Doyle landed in the quiet afternoon street, like a stone dropped into still water. Although Tessa had never heard it before, something deep inside her instinctively turned cold. It was the instinct of someone who'd once worked in an emergency room, someone who'd learned to recognize the scent of trouble long before trouble introduced itself by name. She unfolded the paper and glanced across the figures. Every ounce of discipline she'd built, over years of standing before frightened patients, was needed to keep the man from noticing that she'd just missed a breath. Because the amount written there, recalculated with interest so predatory it could only be described as extortion, was a sum she couldn't possibly earn even if she drew until both her hands were worn raw. Certainly not within such a brutally short deadline. "This interest calculation isn't legal," she said, folding the paper again with fingers that refused to tremble. "Legal?" The man shrugged with the amused expression of someone who'd heard that argument 1,000 times before. "Feel free to go looking for the law. Mr. Doyle has his own way of collecting what's owed. I hear you've got a younger brother in college. Engineering, right? Takes the train from the station at the end of the street every morning. Bright future ahead of him. Would be a shame if he had to start worrying about grown-up money problems, wouldn't it?" He said nothing more. He didn't have to. That casual remark had already accomplished exactly what it was meant to do. It told her they'd done their homework. They'd watched her. They knew the routines of the single most precious thing in her life. He gave her a courteous nod, like an insurance salesman wrapping up a pleasant conversation, climbed into his car, and drove away, leaving the street once more to the sound of dry leaves tumbling across the sidewalk. Tessa remained where she was for a long time afterward, the folded paper lying silently in her lap like a knife wrapped in cloth. That evening she prepared dinner exactly as she always did. She listened while Micah enthusiastically talked about his engineering project and his demanding professor. She smiled in all the right places. She asked all the right questions. Only after her brother had switched off the light, in his bedroom, did she wheel herself over to her drawing desk, pull open the bottom drawer, slip the debt notice all the way beneath a stack of ruined sketches where Micah would never think to look, and then sit beneath the circle of yellow lamplight for a very long time, silently calculating every possible path forward, only to discover that every path ended in the same dead end. Borrow money here to cover money there, sell her reliable wheelchair, and go back to the old one with its damaged caster. Take on so much extra work that both hands would finally give out completely. She didn't know who Fergus Doyle was. She didn't know that his name had become the greatest thorn in the side of one of the most powerful men on the other side of the city. She didn't know that her world and his, two worlds that had never shared the slightest connection, were already being pulled steadily toward one another by an unseen hand, like two storm clouds slowly gathering their charge before the lightning came. That night, for the first time in a very long while, Tessa forgot all about the basin of cold water. She simply let the cramps torture her aching fingers as she continued to draw, because another kind of pain had begun settling deep inside her chest, a fear sharper than ice itself. The fear of someone who'd already lost far too much and understood that there was only one precious thing left in her life that could still be taken away. While Tessa stayed awake through the night with the debt notice hidden beneath the bottom drawer, in an elegant neighborhood on the northern side of the city, Bridget Gallagher sat curled up on the window seat of her apartment, her phone glowing in her hand with the unanswered text message from her brother. It was such an absurdly simple question that it almost made her laugh. What kind of flowers did she like? Bridget stared at those words for a very long time, caught somewhere between laughter and tears, because in all the years she'd spent as the younger sister of the most feared man in Boston, this was the very first time she'd ever seen her brother ask a question so wonderfully foolish. It was also the first time she'd truly become afraid of the very plan she'd created. Because the meeting at the Larkspur hadn't been an accident. It had never been an accident. From reserving the corner table in advance, to spending an entire month pleading with her brother until he finally agreed, to deliberately keeping one crucial detail from Ronan by never telling him that the woman used a wheelchair, every single move had been another piece Bridget had carefully placed onto the board, with the trembling hands of someone, wagering something far greater than herself. She'd hidden the wheelchair from her brother, not because she'd forgotten, but because she needed to know. She needed to hear, with her own ears, who her brother would become during that first unguarded moment. Would he be the man from those cold boardrooms, where everything was measured by profit and advantage? Or would he become someone else entirely? The man she still believed was alive somewhere beneath that dark wool coat, because if Ronan had stood up and walked away the moment he saw the wheelchair, she'd rather have known immediately. She'd rather have buried this entire plan forever than allow that woman to endure the sound of another door closing in her face. With Tessa, she'd hidden the truth from the opposite direction. She'd concealed everything that made the Gallagher name what it was, telling her only that her older brother worked in transportation, that he didn't talk much but was a genuinely kind man. It was a lie so carefully constructed that it hurt even Bridget herself. Part of the pain came from shame, the same shame that had followed her ever since she was a teenage girl, whenever she had to write her family name on an official form. The rest came because she knew with absolute certainty that if Tessa ever heard about the Geller family's 3 generations living in the shadows, a woman who'd already lost almost everything to injustice would have wheeled herself away before lunch had even been served. But there was a secret buried even deeper than those 2 lies, a secret Bridget had never shared with anyone, not even her own brother. Even her friendship with Tessa hadn't begun by chance. People believed the 2 women had met during the volunteer art program at the Children's Hospital, where Bridget had signed up as a volunteer and happened to be assigned to help the gentle smiling artist in the wheelchair. The truth was something entirely different. Bridget had known the name Tessa Monroe long before that. She'd spent months following nothing more than a name buried in old memories. She'd traveled all the way to South Boston, simply to stand at a distance and watch that woman paint murals for neighborhood children. The volunteer art class had been nothing more than a bridge she'd built with her own hands, so she'd have a reason to step into the life of the woman whose door she couldn't, and didn't dare, knock on with the truth. Why would a daughter of the Gallagher family spend so much time searching for a struggling artist? Why did Bridget always turn away to hide her reddened eyes whenever she saw Tessa smile? Why did she always carry an old piece of paper with worn corners inside her wallet, taking it out from time to time to read before carefully putting it away again, as though reciting a sacred vow. Those answers remained locked behind a door Bridget wasn't yet ready to open. All she knew was that tonight, sitting on her window seat overlooking a city slowly filling with evening lights, she felt like someone who'd struck a single match, without realizing how enormous the fire would become. Her plan had only been for those two people to share one meal together. Nothing more. Just enough for her to repay a small part of some invisible debt she'd carried inside herself. Yet now her brother was asking about flowers, and Tessa, during their phone call that afternoon, had casually mentioned the man who worked in transportation not once but twice, using a voice that tried very hard to sound indifferent, though Bridget recognized the truth immediately. The match had ignited something far larger than she'd ever imagined. Bridget drew in a slow breath, typed her reply to her brother. It contained only a single sentence. She likes wildflowers that survive the winter. Then she turned off the screen, rested her head against the cold window pane, and whispered words no one else would ever hear. I'm sorry to both of you, but I couldn't find a better way. There are debts people can't repay with money. They can only repay them with their whole heart. And this is the only clumsy way I know how to repay mine. The invitation arrived on a quiet weekday morning, as simple as the man who'd sent it. There were no elaborate words, no careful preamble, only a single text message saying that he still hadn't decided whether the beef stew from the other day was really the best in the neighborhood, because he'd been too busy listening to her to remember to judge it, so perhaps they ought to conduct another proper test. Tessa sat staring at those few lines much longer than she needed to. She reminded herself about the folded notice hidden beneath the bottom drawer. She reminded herself of every reason she ought to say no. Yet in the end she typed a single short word. Yes, because once a door inside the human heart has been opened even the smallest crack, the wind somehow always finds its own way in. This time he arrived first. Waiting on the table was a small bouquet unlike any she'd ever received before. There were no velvet roses, no elegant lilies, only simple wildflowers in shades of white and violet, still carrying traces of the morning dew, the kind of flowers stubborn enough to bloom beside old stone walls throughout the winter. When she softly asked why he'd chosen those flowers, he answered only that he'd heard there were flowers capable of surviving the winter, and left it there without another explanation. Tessa lowered her eyes, hiding a flicker of confusion among the delicate blossoms, never knowing that answer had first passed through someone else's hands before reaching him. The meal stretched on as though time itself moved more slowly inside the restaurant than it did outside on the streets, and the conversation unfolded naturally, like a ball of yarn rolling freely across the floor. She told him about her work, about the rabbits wearing knitted hats and the gardens without staircases that filled her illustrations. When he asked why every pathway in her paintings was always so wonderfully wide, she smiled and answered, "If I'm allowed to create a world, why wouldn't I make it fit everyone?" He remained silent after hearing those words for so long that she wondered if she'd said something foolish. In truth, he was only thinking that in all his life he'd never heard anyone define power in such a beautiful way. The power to shape a world, and choosing to use that power simply to make the path wider for everyone else. She told him about her afternoons in the children's ward, and her entire face seemed to brighten, as though someone had turned another light on inside her. She told him about the children who always crowded around her wheelchair whenever she arrived, arguing over which colors to use, bickering loudly about whether the dragon should breathe fire or candy, about the little curly-haired girl who insisted every single time that she be painted as a princess riding a dinosaur instead of a horse, about the most serious little boy in the group, who always inspected every mural to make sure she'd used all 7 colors of the rainbow before solemnly giving it his personal seal of approval, and about the joyful cheers that echoed through the hospital corridors whenever another mural was finished. Those crystal-clear bursts of laughter, she said, were the greatest salary she'd ever earned in her entire life. Ronan listened in a way she'd never seen anyone listen before. He didn't nod politely out of habit. He didn't wait impatiently for his own turn to speak. He listened as though every tiny detail deserved to be treasured forever. Every now and then he'd ask a question at exactly the right moment, and each one let her know he hadn't missed a single word she'd spoken. Then it became his turn, and she realized this man spoke about himself in a strangely unfamiliar language. saying things that were true but never quite complete. He told her he worked in transportation, that cargo came and went through the harbor, that his work demanded more nights than days, that at its heart his job was simply making sure everything reached where it was supposed to go. Whenever she gently asked for more, he answered with graceful detours before guiding the conversation somewhere else so naturally that almost no one would have noticed. Almost no one. Because Tessa noticed. She simply chose not to ask any further. Yet there came one brief moment when that invisible wall lowered on its own. It happened when she noticed the tattoo of a rosary wrapped around his left wrist as he reached for the teapot. She asked about it, not with curiosity, but with the quiet tenderness of someone who understood every tattoo carried a story. Ronan lowered his eyes to his wrist for a long moment before speaking, his voice dropping into a deeper register. His mother had owned a wooden rosary, whose beads had grown smooth from passing through her fingers every single evening. She'd been the only person in the world who'd never been afraid of him and never stopped worrying about him. She died while he was still young. The real rosary remained locked inside his safe, but he'd had this one tattooed onto his skin, so the only thing she'd left behind could never be taken away by anyone, not even by himself during the darkest days of his life. He stopped there, as though he'd reached the edge of a cliff, too deep to cross. Tessa didn't ask another question. She simply rested her own hand upon the table, close to his but not touching, leaving only the smallest distance between them, the quiet distance shared by two people who both carried wounds they hadn't yet found the courage to tell, and who recognized those same unseen wounds in each other. Outside, the rain had begun falling once again. Inside, the 2 cups of tea had gone cold long ago, yet neither of them thought to order another. The meetings continued from week to week. There was a coffee shop with a perfectly level entrance that he always somehow managed to find first. There was an afternoon spent strolling beside the river, where he walked beside her wheelchair without ever moving even half a step ahead. There was dinner at a small neighborhood restaurant, whose chef came all the way to their table to greet him with a degree of respect that seemed just a little excessive for someone who supposedly worked in transportation. Through every one of those meetings, however, there was one part of Tessa that never completely relaxed. It was the emergency room nurse she'd once been, the woman trained to observe, to read another person's body faster than their words could explain it, the woman she'd tried to let retire years ago, but had never truly managed to dismiss. That nurse noticed that no matter where they went, Ronan always chose the seat with his back against the wall and his face toward the entrance. Even while they were talking, his eyes would occasionally sweep across the doorway in a movement so quick it resembled nothing more than a blink, a habit no one learned, working in transportation, but one drilled into people who lived in places where sitting in the wrong chair could cost them their lives. That nurse had held his hand once, when he helped guide her over an uneven stretch of pavement. The sensitive tips of her fingers read the silent language written across his palm, a language she'd once recognized in the hands of certain patients brought into the emergency room. The calluses weren't where they belonged on someone who carried cargo or pushed paperwork. They rested exactly where she wished she didn't know they belonged. That nurse also noticed the tall man in the gray coat, who always seemed to be reading a newspaper in the far corner, appearing in more than one cafe often enough that coincidence no longer seemed like the right word. She noticed, too, the afternoon Ronan reached to catch a coffee cup before it fell, and his shirt sleeve slipped just enough to expose a long, narrow scar along his side. Her professional eyes recognized the pattern of healed tissue instantly. It wasn't surgical. It wasn't the result of an industrial accident. When she asked about it without thinking, he calmly pulled his sleeve back into place and answered with only 3 words. Something from my youth. He brushed the answer away as lightly as someone dusting a speck of dirt from a jacket, yet for one brief instant she'd seen his eyes darken by the faintest shade. Night after night, while sitting alone beneath the yellow circle of light at her drawing table, those scattered pieces would quietly gather themselves together inside her thoughts. Every time, Tessa deliberately scattered them apart again. She found a gentle explanation for each one. Successful businessmen were naturally careful about where they sat. Plenty of young men working around the docks developed rough hands from hauling cables and heavy equipment. In a city this size, seeing the same face in several cafes wasn't all that unusual. Everyone carried at least one scar they didn't care to explain. She herself had scars she'd never spoken about either. Piece by piece, she built a fence around the man with those soft, reasonable explanations, not because she was naive, but because for the first time in 4 years she'd found somewhere that made her want to believe again. And people often fear losing that belief far more than they fear having it betrayed. Then one rainy night, while the steady tapping of rain echoed against her windowsill, and her aching right hand rested inside the basin of cold water, the silence loosened something inside her memory. Without warning, she found herself thinking about another man from years ago, the man who'd once placed an engagement ring on her finger, the man who'd remained faithfully beside her hospital bed during those first terrible weeks with such unwavering devotion that everyone around them praised him, only to disappear from her life one ordinary morning, as though he'd never existed at all. His phone number no longer belonged to him. His apartment had been vacated. Her co-workers at the hospital could only stare at her in confusion, saying he'd resigned without warning. Through all the years since, she'd never been able to shape that departure into anything that truly made sense. It hadn't felt like someone simply falling out of love. It had been too sudden, too clean, almost as though some unseen hand had lifted him completely out of her life, rather than allowing him to walk away on his own. She'd always forced herself to dismiss that thought, because it sounded like the kind of comforting fantasy people invented to make unbearable pain easier to survive. Yet tonight, for reasons she couldn't explain, the thought had returned and refused to leave. Tessa slowly withdrew her hand from the cold water and dried it carefully. Only then did she realize she wasn't trembling because of the cold. She was trembling because she'd suddenly understood that the two men from the two very different chapters of her life shared one deeply unsettling similarity. Both of them possessed places inside themselves she could never reach, silent doors that remained firmly closed while she stood outside, with neither the courage nor the right to knock. The only difference was that the first time she'd never knocked at all, and in the end she'd lost everything. Now she found herself standing before another closed door, and she no longer knew which frightened her more, whatever waited on the other side of it, or the possibility that she might once again choose to turn away and pretend it had never been there at all. It happened on a weekend evening when Tessa casually mentioned that it had been so long since she'd last sat inside a movie theater. She missed the comforting darkness and the smell of fresh popcorn. She missed laughing and crying alongside complete strangers, gathered beneath the same glow of the screen. Ronan, a man who remembered everything she said as though carving it into stone, quietly chose one of the city's beloved old theaters for the following evening. Only when they arrived did they discover something people who walked on 2 healthy legs almost never had reason to notice. The entrance to the auditorium lay beyond a long flight of stone steps. The elevator intended for wheelchair users had been broken for quite some time, marked only by a faded apology, sign carelessly taped to the wall. The young theater manager could do nothing except rub his hands together awkwardly. Tessa was accustomed to moments like these. She'd grown so used to them that she carried a ready-made smile for exactly this purpose. She was about to tell him it was perfectly fine, that they could simply take a walk instead, but before she managed to say a single word, Ronan turned toward the manager and, in a voice no louder than someone making a dinner reservation, asked whether there were any screenings still available that evening, which auditorium had level access through the side entrance, and how much it would cost to reserve the entire room. Everything afterward unfolded as quickly as the snap of a finger. The manager disappeared, then returned with the theater director personally hurrying over wearing the brightest smile imaginable. The side entrance was unlocked. Someone rushed to remove the faded out-of-order sign. Less than half an hour later, Tessa found herself sitting in the middle of a vast empty auditorium, with not another soul in sight, a giant screen glowing solely for 2 people. It should have been the most romantic experience of her life. Instead, surrounded by hundreds of empty seats, she felt her heart growing colder minute by minute, because she'd dreamed of disappearing into a crowd, of becoming nothing more than an ordinary moviegoer among other ordinary people. Somehow she'd become the opposite instead, an exception separated from everyone else, a problem solved with a checkbook, and the warm darkness she'd missed had become something enormous and strangely lonely. She sat through the entire film without remembering a single moment of it. When they reached the parking lot afterward, she stopped beneath one of the yellow lights and spoke in a voice she fought to keep steady. "Thank you. But please don't ever do that again." Ronan looked at her, genuinely confused. "What did I do wrong? I thought you wanted to see the movie." At that question, everything she'd been holding inside throughout the evening, and perhaps throughout the past several weeks, quietly overflowed. She told him everything. She never raised her voice, yet every word came with the clean precision of a line drawn across paper. "I didn't need an entire theater. I only needed a ramp. What I wanted wasn't for the world to step aside for me. I wanted the world to have room for me." Those two things sound almost identical, but they're separated by an ocean. When you rented the whole theater, you thought you were lifting me up. What you actually did was draw a circle around me. You turned me into someone who had to be isolated in order to be protected. And even when it's done with kindness, it's still another way of reminding me that I'm different. She paused for a moment before speaking the sentence he'd remember for the rest of his life. "Your money bought this entire theater. But there's one thing it can't buy: respect. Because respect isn't something you purchase. It's something you learn. You learn it by asking someone what they need, instead of deciding for them what they need." Ronan stood beneath the parking lot lights for a very long time. Tessa quietly prepared herself for every reaction she'd learned to expect from wounded male pride. Anger. Excuses, a dismissive shrug before walking away. The man standing before her did none of those things. He simply remained there, absorbing every word like a great stone standing against the sea. Then he did something that surprised her even more than the afternoon he'd knelt beside her wheelchair to tighten the loose bolt. He lowered his head, only slightly, but unmistakably. "You're right," he said. "I've spent my whole life solving problems by flattening every obstacle in my path. Somewhere along the way, I forgot to ask the person living with that obstacle whether they even wanted it flattened." Then he lifted his eyes to meet hers and asked a question no one had ever asked her during the 4 years she'd lived in that wheelchair. "Then next time, what would you like me to do? Not what will I do for you. What would you like me to do?" Only one word changed, yet it shifted the entire balance between them. Inside her chest, Tessa felt something quietly settle back into its rightful place after years of being painfully out of alignment. Her voice softened. "Next time, if this door is closed, then we'll go find another one together." "That's all," he nodded with the earnest attention of a student committing an important lesson to memory. Then the two of them walked away beneath a sky that had finally cleared. Neither of them spoke very much after that, but both knew they'd just passed through something fairy tales never bothered to tell. The moment when two real people collided through real imperfections, and instead of breaking each other apart, they began learning the shape of each other's hearts. That night, after making sure Tessa had reached the entrance to her little street, and waiting until the light in her ground-floor apartment came on before pulling away, Ronan didn't drive home. Instead, he returned to the office on the top floor, overlooking the harbor, the place he always found himself returning to on nights when sleep refused to come, which meant almost every night. He didn't switch on the lights. The room was illuminated only by the borrowed glow rising from the city below, through the enormous windows, just enough to trace the outline of the heavy wooden desk that had once belonged to his father. The shelves of files that held an empire, and the man sitting motionless in the leather chair, his thumb slowly moving across each bead of the rosary tattooed around his left wrist. One bead, one breath, one bead, one breath. It was a ritual that had replaced sleep, one he'd practiced ever since the year everything had come crashing down onto his shoulders. His insomnia wasn't an illness of the body. He knew that better than anyone. It was the tax memory collected every single night, because the moment he closed his eyes, this office became the office from years ago. The same wooden desk, the same view overlooking the harbor, the same place where his father had stood listening, while his hot-headed young son passionately argued that the shipment scheduled for that night should be rerouted along the southern route to avoid a newly assigned patrol. On paper it had been brilliant reasoning. Every calculation had been correct. Every piece of logic had pointed in the same direction, except that the southern route was precisely where the trap had already been waiting. His father, a man who distrusted everything in life except his own son, had nodded his agreement. The world called it a perfectly orchestrated assassination, carried out by an unseen enemy. People comforted him by saying no one could have predicted it, that the mastermind behind the ambush was the one truly responsible. Rationally, he knew every one of those things was true. Yet another courtroom assembled every night beneath his breastbone, where the only judge was himself, and the verdict never changed. If you hadn't opened your mouth that night, he'd still be alive. So he stayed awake. He stayed awake to avoid standing trial in that courtroom inside his dreams. He stayed awake, moving through the beads of the rosary the way his mother once had. His mother, who'd begged him to cleanse the Gallagher name before leaving this world herself, spared the agony of watching her husband die because of one sentence spoken by her own son. Yet tonight, among the familiar rhythm of those invisible beads, something unexpected slipped in, a woman's bright, genuine laughter. A question asked beneath the yellow lights of a parking lot. "What would you like me to do?" Ronan suddenly realized he was smiling alone in the darkness, an expression this office had never witnessed before. Yet that very smile frightened him, because a man who survived by calculating every possible move now stood before a game he was afraid to calculate to the end. If he continued forward, he'd draw that woman closer to a world he himself desperately wished to escape. If he walked away instead, he'd be the one closing the only door through which any light had entered his life in so many years. A knock at the door cut through his thoughts. Connor stepped inside, carrying the usual stack of evening reports, and placed them upon the desk. But, instead of leaving immediately as he's always did, the salt-and-pepper-haired man remained standing beside the window. He looked down at the harbor for a long time before finally speaking, his voice steady and direct, exactly as every word he'd spoken throughout all the years he'd served 2 generations of the Gallagher family. "Let me say something just once, not as your employee, but as the man who carried you when you were still a little boy. I had someone look into her, not to hurt her, only to make sure no one was using her to set a trap for you. She's clean, so clean that reading her file left a lump in my throat. Someone like her doesn't belong in our world, Ronan. This world doesn't spare anything that's clean. It stains everything it touches. If you truly care about her, then you have to understand that. These 2 worlds can't become one. The person standing between 2 currents is always the one who drowns first." Ronan remained silent for a long time after hearing those words, because he knew they came from loyalty and nothing else. At last he quietly asked, "So you think I should let her go?" Connor didn't answer immediately. He kept staring at the yellow lights scattered across the harbor below. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped lower than before, roughened ever so slightly, as though the words were no longer traveling outward but echoing back into himself. "In our world, the moment people discover who you love, that's exactly where you become weak. The more you love, the deeper the weakness. The safest thing is never to let anyone know. Never let anyone see the place inside you that's still soft. Otherwise they'll grab hold of it and break it." The moment those words left his mouth, it was almost as though he realized something himself. He gave Ronan a brief nod and left the office a little more quickly than usual, leaving Ronan with the vague feeling that the last part of that warning hadn't truly been meant for him at all. The feeling lingered only for a moment before disappearing beneath everything else weighing on his mind. He returned once more to the rhythm of the rosary, to the game of chess he no longer dared calculate to its conclusion, never knowing that downstairs, inside the elevator descending toward the lobby, the most loyal man he'd ever known was leaning heavily against the wall of the cabin, his eyes closed, one hand gripping the phone hidden inside his inner coat pocket, as though he were clutching a piece of burning coal. That night, Tessa stayed up later than usual because she had a set of illustrations that had to be delivered first thing in the morning. Like so many people who worked alone through the night, she switched on the old television in the corner of the room simply to fill the silence with human voices, turning the volume down until it became nothing more than a gentle murmur behind her. The late evening news drifted past her ears like water flowing over stone. Gas prices, the weather, a traffic jam on one of the bridges. Then 3 words pierced straight through that comfortable haze and struck her squarely in the chest. Gunfire, harbor, Gallagher. She turned toward the screen. Flashing blue and red lights washed across endless rows of shipping containers in the darkness. Police barricades. A reporter standing before the camera described a violent confrontation that had just erupted at the eastern docks, between rival underground interests operating within the city. Fortunately, no one had been killed. Then the anchor shifted to a name that, according to police, had unofficially controlled that entire waterfront for years, despite the fact that no court had ever managed to prove anything against him. Ronan Gallagher, the third-generation heir to the family widely regarded as the most powerful criminal organization in Boston. The moment those words were spoken, a photograph filled half the screen. It had clearly been taken from a distance, slightly blurred, showing a man in a dark wool coat stepping out of a car in the middle of the harbor. Yet no matter how indistinct the picture was, Tessa couldn't fail to recognize those shoulders, that jawline, and beneath the cuff of his left sleeve, the edge of a tattoo she'd once sat close enough to count bead by bead. The paintbrush slipped from her hand and struck the floor. She sat frozen before the television, while the reporter continued speaking, but the sound had vanished somewhere far away. The entire world collapsed into nothing except the thunder of blood pounding inside her temples. Inside that empty silence, every scattered piece she'd spent weeks deliberately separating suddenly flew back together, locking into place with merciless speed. The chair that always faced the entrance with its back against the wall, his eyes sweeping across every doorway whenever someone entered, the calluses in all the wrong places on his palms, the long scar along his ribs and the quiet explanation, something from my youth, the man in the gray coat reading newspapers in the corner of different cafes, the chef's excessive respect, even the effortless way he'd rented an entire movie theater as casually as someone buying a loaf of bread. Every single clue had been there from the very beginning, every single one. The nurse inside her had seen them all. Only the woman inside her had picked up each clue and quietly locked it away inside a drawer because she wanted to believe. Dear God, she'd wanted to believe so desperately. The pain arrived a few breaths after the shock, and it didn't come alone. It dragged behind it an older pain from the deepest part of the years she'd believed had finally frozen over. Another man's face returned to her. The man who'd sat beside her hospital bed for 3 straight weeks, with a devotion so gentle it had moved everyone in the ward. The man who'd stroked her hair. The man who'd made promises. The man who'd been kind, so unbelievably kind, until the morning he disappeared without leaving behind a single trace. The cruelest lesson of her life had been written by that very kindness. The most terrifying people were never those who openly revealed their cruelty. They were the ones who wore kindness as a mask, because no one ever guards themselves against someone who's smiling at them. And now history was mocking her by repeating itself in an even crueler form. The man who'd knelt in the middle of a restaurant to tighten the loose bolt on her wheelchair. The man who'd given her wildflowers that survived the winter. The man who'd lowered his head beneath the parking lot lights, admitted he was wrong, and asked, "What would you like me to do?" That man turned out to be the name the entire city lowered its voice to speak. She no longer knew which hurt more, discovering who he really was, or realizing that someone like him had been capable of such extraordinary gentleness. Because if the most genuine kindness she'd touched in 4 long years had grown out of darkness itself, then by what measure was she ever supposed to judge another human heart again? Her phone lit up on the table. A message from him. He was asking whether she'd gone to bed yet. Attached was a photograph of a patch of little purple and white wildflowers he'd found on his way home. Message. Through tears, she couldn't even remember beginning to cry. Her trembling fingers moved across the screen, not to answer him, but to do the one thing she'd sworn to herself 4 years earlier she would always do the instant she caught the scent of deception. She blocked his number. Then she blocked Bridget's as well. She switched off the phone and threw it into the drawer. Afterward, she sat upright in the apartment, lit only by the silent, flickering glow of the television, wrapped both arms around herself, and for the first time since the day she'd been discharged from the hospital, Tessa Monroe cried out loud. She wept like a dam collapsing beneath unbearable pressure, not because one more man had turned out to be a liar, but because she suddenly realized that her heart, patched together so many times after being torn apart, was still innocent enough to break this completely. The days that followed passed beneath a silence so heavy it seemed almost solid. Tessa continued to paint. She continued preparing breakfast every morning. She continued smiling at exactly the right moments whenever Micah spoke. Yet anyone who looked closely would have noticed the shadows beneath her eyes growing darker each day. and how, during the long hours she spent painting late into the night, her brush would sometimes stop halfway across the page and remain suspended there for what felt like forever. Her phone stayed inside the drawer, switched off, like a wound wrapped so tightly it wouldn't have to be seen. As for Ronan, he never came knocking at her door. He never stationed anyone outside her street. He never used a single ounce of the power he possessed to force his way back into her life. That silence from him filled her with relief, yet somehow it also hurt in a way she refused to give a name. Then Thursday afternoon arrived. According to her usual schedule, Tessa went to the children's hospital to finish the mural she'd been painting along the pediatric corridor. She had just finished mixing her tray of colors when the senior charge nurse, a woman who'd known her since the very beginning, quietly pulled up a chair beside her. The older woman's expression carried the weight of someone holding a story too large for her own heart. She lowered her voice, as though afraid the words themselves might shatter. "Would you believe it? Last week, the finance department received an enormous payment from an anonymous foundation. It wiped out every outstanding hospital bill for an entire wing of struggling families in our department. Some of those accounts had been sitting there for years. One family was about to file paperwork to stop treatment because they couldn't pay anymore. Now every single debt is gone. No announcements, no ceremony, no name attached. Not even one of those oversized presentation checks that wealthy donors always seem to love. The foundation made only one request in writing. The donor's identity has to remain secret forever." Her eyes had begun to glisten by then. "I've spent nearly my whole life doing this job. I've met plenty of people who donated money because they wanted someone to thank them. But someone who gives this much just to hide from gratitude? I've never seen anything like it." Tessa's fingers stiffened around her paintbrush. A feeling she hadn't invited quietly settled inside her, and she immediately tried to crush it beneath reason. There were countless wealthy people in this city, she reminded herself. It could have been anyone, but instincts don't survive on reason. They survive on details. And the detail arrived only moments later, when the senior nurse sighed softly before continuing. "The strangest part is that the foundation also included a separate grant, asking the hospital to repair the wheelchair lift at the side entrance. You know the one. It's been broken forever. Nobody's ever paid the slightest attention to it. Yet in the paperwork they specifically wrote that improving access for wheelchair users should be treated as a priority." I couldn't stop thinking about that line. Whoever wrote those instructions must have pushed someone's wheelchair before. Otherwise, how would they ever have noticed something so small? Tessa turned back toward the unfinished mural so the older nurse wouldn't see her eyes, because at that moment all she could see inside her own mind was a man lowering his head beneath the parking lot lights, quietly asking, "What would you like me to do?" And suddenly she understood that he'd found his own answer, not by renting an empty theater just for her anymore, but by opening a path that belonged to everyone like her. Quietly, without a name, without ever expecting her to know, without even giving himself the chance to receive credit. The sharp black and white line she'd drawn, after watching that news broadcast, the line she'd leaned on to keep herself standing, suddenly developed a long crack. Because perhaps someone could pretend to be kind in front of one woman, but nobody pretended for anonymous hospital debts. Nobody pretended for a wheelchair lift, tucked away at a forgotten side entrance that they themselves might never use for the rest of their lives. That night, when she stepped outside to bring in the paintings she'd left to dry in the evening air, Tessa noticed a small cardboard box resting neatly beside her front door. There was no delivery driver, no ringing doorbell. She picked it up and opened it. Inside lay a complete set of spare bolts made specifically for her model of wheelchair, along with a perfectly sized wrench. Everything had been arranged with the same careful orderliness as instruments inside a medical kit. Folded at the bottom of the box was a single handwritten note. The handwriting was straight and firm. It contained only a few simple lines. "I'm not asking you to open the door. I just don't want your wheel to come loose again, whether I'm there or not. My number hasn't changed. If one day you ever need anything at any hour, it'll still ring." Tessa stood outside her front door for a very long time, with the box resting across her lap, while the cool breeze of early autumn drifted through the old neighborhood. Before going back inside, she found herself doing one small thing she couldn't even explain to herself. She opened the drawer. She switched her phone back on, Then she opened the blocked contacts list and removed exactly one number. Only one. She didn't send a message. She didn't make a call. She simply removed the block, like someone quietly unlatching a single window inside a house that had been sealed shut for years, not to invite anyone inside, but so that if one day another storm came, a cry for help would still have a way to find its way out. On the very same night that Tessa removed one name from her blocked contacts, across the city Ronan sat alone in his dark office, with the small safe standing open before him. Resting in the palm of his hand was the real wooden rosary, its beads polished smooth by countless evenings spent passing through his mother's fingers. He only opened the safe to take it out on nights when the tattooed copy around his wrist was no longer enough, and tonight was one of those nights. A night when memory didn't bother knocking before entering. It simply flooded in. He'd been very young when his mother fell ill, still at that age when people believe their parents are mountains that can never wear away. Her illness belonged to the kind that medicine at the time could offer only the narrowest sliver of hope, an experimental treatment overseas so expensive it left people struggling to breathe just hearing the price. Money had never been a problem for the Gallagher family. It never had been. His father had paid the deposit that very night. Yet the following morning, the frail woman lying in the hospital bed called both father and son into the room. She took her husband's hand and spoke in the gentle voice that never allowed anyone to argue with her. She said she knew exactly where every dollar of that money had come from gambling debts that had stolen people's homes, from interest payments that strangled those already desperate, from shipping containers no one was ever allowed to ask about. She said she'd spent her whole life closing her eyes and living upon that money, because she'd loved one man with all her heart, but she didn't want to prolong her own life by even one more day using it. "Let this body stay as clean as it still can," she whispered. "Let me leave this world that way," his father had shouted. He'd smashed furniture inside the room. He'd fallen to his knees, begging his stubborn wife to change her mind. She'd only shaken her head. During those final weeks, when his father could no longer bear staying in the hospital and buried himself in work instead, Ronan became the one who spent the most time beside her bed. There, inside a room, carrying the scent of medicine mixed with the fragrance of wildflowers, someone had gathered from the hillside. She slowly passed this very rosary through her fingers before placing it into her son's hand. She looked directly into his eyes with eyes that had grown deeply sunken, yet still held an extraordinary light. Then she spoke the words that would become the backbone of his entire life. "I won't live long enough to see it, but you will. Wash the Gallagher name clean. I don't need you to become a saint. I only need one day. When people hear our family name, other mothers won't feel the need to pull their children closer. Promise me," and he had promised. He'd promised through the tears of a young son, who couldn't possibly understand the weight he'd just accepted upon his shoulders. Then she'd gone, as softly as the final breath of someone who'd spent an entire lifetime holding it in. He'd believed that promise would be fulfilled, little by little, alongside his father, until the night 4 years earlier, the night of the southern route and the carefully prepared ambush, the night that transformed him into the head of the family inside a room filled with waiting men. What no one but Ronan ever knew was that he'd almost walked away. He'd almost abandoned everything and disappeared from the city forever. The only thing that stopped him was one private meeting where he sat listening to the man considered the strongest candidate to replace his father, a distant uncle whose eyes were as cold as money itself, enthusiastically outlining the family's future. "Times have changed," the man had said. "White powder is the real gold mine now. We've already got the network. All it takes is one word, and the shipments will flow into every neighborhood, every school gate." Ronan had listened to every single word, beneath the table. His hand gripped the tattooed rosary around his wrist so tightly it left deep marks across his skin. Then he'd stood up and accepted the chair he despised, not because he'd ever wanted its power, but because in that moment he'd understood one bitter truth. The only way to stop the monster from sinking its teeth into children was to be the one holding its chain. From that day forward, he'd held it. He'd held it through 3 unbreakable rules. He'd held it through a years-long plan to slowly pull one piece of the empire after another into legitimate business, every step as dangerous as dismantling the fuse of a live bomb. He'd held it in absolute solitude, because the person standing between 2 opposing currents can never allow either side to see how tired he truly is. Tonight, turning his mother's rosary through his fingers inside the dark office, Ronan finally understood why he couldn't let that woman go, even after she'd closed every door between them. Among all the people he'd met since taking that chair, Tessa was the first person who'd ever looked at him without seeing the Gallagher name, and the cruel irony was that she walked away on the very night she finally did see it. He didn't blame her. How could he? He only wished that someday she'd discover that beneath the Gallagher name lived a promise made to a woman who loved wildflowers, a promise he was still repaying every single day with the whole of his life. The phone shattered Tessa's fragile sleep at that hour of the night, when every call arrives wearing the face of disaster. An unfamiliar number glowed on the screen. The voice on the other end introduced herself as an emergency room nurse and asked whether she was Micah Monroe's sister. Her brother had been brought in by passers-by not long ago. His condition was stable now. Could she come to the hospital immediately? Tessa heard every word in a strangely detached state. Her hand had already reached for her coat before she realized it. She was already turning her wheelchair toward the door. The body of the former emergency room nurse moved with the flawless precision of a machine trained for crisis, while the heart of an older sister plunged freely into a bottomless well. The rideshare crossed a sleeping city that seemed to stretch for an entire lifetime. As soon as she rolled through the familiar glass doors of the emergency department, the sharp scent of antiseptic and the harsh white lights dragged her backward through the years with merciless force. The only difference was that once she'd walked into this place, to pull strangers back from the darkness. Tonight the darkness was holding the only brother she had left. Micah lay in the bed at the corner of the room. She saw the white bandage wrapped around his head before she truly saw his face. For one terrible instant the entire hallway seemed to tilt beneath her. Then he turned, saw her, and the very first thing that young man did with lips still split and bleeding was force out a smile. The second thing he did was ask, his voice hoarse yet carrying that same innocent confusion that had always belonged to him, "Tessa, why are you here at this hour? Haven't you gone to sleep yet? I remember you said you had to finish painting tonight." Tessa gripped the rims of her wheels so tightly she thought they might break. Because there are people in this world who lie wounded in a hospital bed and still worry first about whether someone else has eaten. The attending physician explained everything using medical language Tessa understood even before he finished speaking. Soft tissue injuries, observation for the head because of his previous history, a few days of monitoring. "He's lucky," the doctor said. Lucky. That was the word he chose. Tessa nodded her thanks while only one question echoed inside her mind. Who? She didn't have to wait long for the answer. Once they were alone, Micah stared at the ceiling for a very long time before beginning to speak. His voice grew quieter and quieter, like someone making a confession. Tuition had gone up this semester. He'd noticed how thin she'd become lately. Every night her desk lamp stayed on until nearly dawn. She always hid her right hand behind her back whenever he looked at her. Then someone near campus had told him about a place where students could borrow money quickly without collateral. He'd thought he was grown up now. He could work part-time. He'd pay it back himself. He'd only meant to borrow a small amount. But the papers they'd given him to sign had been filled with tiny lines of print, and that small loan kept growing week after week, like some living creature. By the time he could no longer keep up, they'd been waiting for him tonight on the deserted road behind the dormitory. "They didn't take anything," he whispered. "They only told me, 'Tell your sister. Mr. Doyle doesn't like waiting for anyone more than twice.'" The name fell into the hospital room, and Tessa felt the blood inside her veins turn to ice. Doyle, the same name written across the demand notice hidden beneath the bottom drawer at home. They had surrounded both brother and sister from opposite directions, without either of them realizing it. Yet what hurt her even more than that name was what Micah said next. He turned his face toward the darkness beyond the window and spoke so softly she almost didn't hear him. "I'm sorry, I just wanted, just once, to carry something for you instead. I know, Tessa, don't think I don't know. If you hadn't been driving me to that exam that day, you wouldn't be sitting in that wheelchair now. I owe you both your legs. I owe you that, Tessa. And I don't know how I'll ever repay it." Tessa went completely still. For all these years she'd believed. She'd comforted herself with the thought that the empty places in her brother's memory had been a blessing. that at least the accident itself had been torn from the pages of his life. But the page had never disappeared. Micah had simply folded it closed with his own hands and pretended all these years, just as she herself had pretended every time she'd smiled and said tomorrow. 2 siblings, 2 gentle liars, each carrying the same unbearable pain, while believing they were carrying it for the other. She took his hand and said nothing, because every word in the world was smaller than the silence between them. She remained beside him until Micah finally drifted to sleep. Then she wheeled herself out into the deserted hallway, where the white light stretched her shadow long across the polished floor. She took out her phone. Inside her contacts, her finger came to rest upon the only number she'd removed from the blocked list on the night she'd found the box of spare bolts outside her door. She stared at the name for a long time, thinking about every reason not to call. Every one of them was still there. Every one of them remained true. Then she thought about the white bandage wrapped around her brother's head. She thought about the name Doyle, and the words more than twice. In that moment, Tessa understood a truth that only people with nowhere left to turn ever truly understand. Pride is a luxury reserved for those who still have something else left to lose. She pressed the call button and lifted the phone to her ear. On the other end of the line, deep in the middle of the night, it rang only once before someone answered. He didn't ask why she'd called after so many weeks of silence. He didn't ask why she'd chosen this hour of the night. Throughout the brief phone call, so short it contained little more than the sound of her breathing and the 3 words naming the hospital, he didn't ask a single question. He only said 2 words. "I'm coming," then he hung up. What followed happened so impossibly quickly for a city this large that, before Tessa could truly comprehend it, she saw the broad-shouldered man in the dark wool coat, striding through the glass doors of the emergency department, raindrops from the night storm still clinging to his hair. The first thing he did wasn't walk straight to her. Instead, he stopped several feet away, leaving exactly enough distance for someone who understood he hadn't yet been invited back into her life. His eyes asked the question his mouth never spoke, and only after she gave the slightest nod did he come closer. He stood there listening while she told him everything. He listened from beginning to end, from the folded notice hidden beneath the bottom drawer, to the tiny print buried inside Micah's loan agreement, to the name Doyle and the warning, about waiting no more than twice. Not a single feature changed on his face as she spoke. Yet Tessa, who'd spent years reading patients' faces before they uttered a word, saw exactly what was happening inside those dark bottle green eyes. Something inside them was growing colder. Colder still, like a lake freezing from its edges toward its center. And for the first time she caught a glimpse of why the entire city lowered its voice whenever they spoke the Gallagher name. He asked only one question. "Will you let me handle this my way?" After one long glance through the doorway toward the room, where her brother slept with a white bandage wrapped around his head. Tessa nodded. She never learned exactly what happened that night. She pieced it together only much later from scattered fragments. There had been a meeting arranged just before dawn inside a neutral warehouse, governed by the unwritten laws of the underworld. Ronan had arrived with only Connor and a leather briefcase. Across the table waited Fergus Doyle's representatives, wearing the confident smiles of men convinced they held the stronger hand. Those smiles slowly disappeared after Ronan opened the briefcase. The story would later be told in voices filled with awe. He placed on the table every dollar of both debts, principal and accumulated interest, all paid from his own personal accounts, every cent fully traceable to him rather than to the Gallagher family, together with a debt cancellation document already prepared, requiring nothing more than a signature. Then he spoke one sentence that carried more weight than any threat. "Go back and tell Mr. Doyle that from this moment forward the Monroes are under the protection of Ronan Gallagher. Anyone who touches them has chosen to touch me, and I'm different from my father in every possible way except one. No one lays a hand on my people twice. The papers were signed. The money was counted." The meeting ended before sunrise, without a sound louder than the snap of the leather briefcase closing. Yet what remained carved forever into Tessa's memory wasn't the disappearance of the debt. It was what happened shortly before dawn, when Ronan returned to the hospital, handed her the signed cancellation papers, and instead of allowing her to drown in gratitude, pulled up a plastic chair and sat down until he was level with her eyes in the deserted hallway. Then he spoke words no man had ever spoken to her before. Before you thank me, you deserve to know exactly what happened tonight. That money is clean. The way I solved this isn't. I didn't report Doyle's predatory loan operation to the police like an ordinary citizen would, because that road is too slow, and men like Doyle have more than enough lawyers to twist it. I used the weight of the name you fear as a shield to protect you. That means I just pulled you closer to the very world I should have been keeping you away from. I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty. I'm telling you because another man once hid the truth from you, and I swore I'd never become the second one. This is who I really am, Tessa. I'm a man trying to crawl out of the darkness, but I haven't made it out yet. What I did tonight isn't clean by your standards, and maybe it won't be for a very long time. The only promise I can honestly make is this. Every day I'll take one more step toward the light. How far I finally get, and whether you want to see me waiting at the end of that road, that's entirely your choice. After saying those words, he stood up, placed a container of hot porridge from the only restaurant still open at that hour on the small table beside her, gently reminded her to eat, because dawn was almost here and Micah would need his sister strong, then walked toward the exit without lingering for even a moment in hopes she'd ask him to stay. Tessa remained seated there, watching the dark outline of his coat disappear beneath the white hospital lights, the warmth of the porridge cradled in her hands, while her heart struggled with something she'd had no name for during the past 4 years. She suddenly realized there are people in this world who never ask for your trust. Instead, they quietly place the truth into your hands, both its light and its darkness, then step back and wait for your judgment. And that power, the power to know everything and still be free to choose for yourself, was the greatest gift she'd received since the day she began living in that wheelchair. Micah was discharged from the hospital on a morning washed clean by clearing skies. In the days that followed, a new rhythm slowly formed between the two of them, careful and unhurried. There were brief text messages. One afternoon, Ronan stopped by only long enough to drop off vitamins for Micah before quietly leaving again. Then, on a Sunday afternoon, Tessa sent him one simple message. I want to hear everything, from the beginning. The truth, he came. He sat down across from her inside the tiny ground-floor apartment, where the familiar circle of yellow lamplight still spilled across her drawing table. For the first time in his life, Ronan Gallagher told his entire story to someone who didn't carry the Gallagher name. He told her about the mother who'd chosen to leave this world with a clean soul, rather than live one more day on money that carried the tears of other people. He told her about the promise he'd made beside her hospital bed. He told her about the night 4 years earlier, about the southern route that had stolen both his father and his ability to sleep. He told her about the private meeting, where he'd listened to men eagerly mapping out ways to send white powder flowing toward school gates. He told her why he'd accepted the chair he despised. He told her about the quiet plan he'd spent years carrying out, moving one piece of the empire after another into the light of legitimate business, one dock, one company at a time, as slowly and carefully as removing bricks from a fortress, without letting the walls collapse onto the innocent people still living inside it. He told the story without decorating it, without asking for forgiveness. He admitted every shadow he still hadn't managed to wash away. When he'd finished, he simply sat there in silence like a defendant waiting for judgment. Tessa listened to every word without interrupting. Then, instead of delivering a verdict, she did the one thing he'd never expected. She answered his honesty with the only thing equal to it, the truth about herself. A truth she'd buried so deeply that sometimes she'd almost convinced herself it had disappeared forever. Her voice began calmly before gradually trembling like the surface of a lake meeting the wind. You already know about the accident, about my legs, about Micah. But there's something that isn't written in any medical record. That afternoon, inside that car, it wasn't only the two of us. There was someone else with me. She lowered her eyes. I was pregnant. Just a tiny little life that hadn't had the chance to meet the world yet. The baby belonged to me and the man I was about to marry. We'd planned to tell both our families that weekend. I'd even painted a little picture to announce it. A tiny green shoot growing upward from 2 hands. Her tears began falling onto the hands resting quietly in her lap. Then the crash happened. When I woke up in the hospital, they told me I'd lost 2 things at once. My legs and that little life. The doctors also said my chances of ever carrying another child were almost gone. Her shoulders shook as she spoke. "I've never told anyone. Not even Micah. The only other person who ever knew disappeared and took that memory with him. I've carried it alone for 4 years. You're the first person I've ever told. And maybe because of that, I need to tell you one more thing. If you're imagining any kind of future with me, then you deserve to know exactly what you're choosing." Ronan offered no comforting words. Instead, he rose from his chair and lowered himself onto one knee before her wheelchair, just as he'd done that first afternoon at the Larkspur. Only this time there was no loose bolt waiting to be tightened. He simply held out both hands with his palms turned upward, not as someone claiming something, but as someone offering an invitation. Tessa placed her tear-soaked hands into his. Then he spoke, slowly and clearly. "I'm not choosing a future, I'm choosing a person. Whatever shape the future takes, we'll draw it together." Besides, a faint smile touched his face. "You're much better at drawing than I am." It was only there, held safely inside his embrace after every wall between them had finally fallen away, that Tessa shared the last edge of the wound she'd hidden for so long. She told him about the kind man who'd disappeared. She explained that he'd been a resident physician at the very hospital that had admitted her on the night of the accident. He'd been on duty, he'd been there, yet she'd never understood how someone could vanish so completely, so suddenly, as though he'd been lifted out of her life by invisible hands. Beneath her fingertips she felt Ronan's shoulders become rigid. He repeated her words one by one. "He was at the hospital that admitted you that very night?" Then he fell silent for a very long time. It was the silence of a man who'd just spotted a single thread connecting two pieces of cloth that had always seemed unrelated. Because a doctor present that night might have seen things the people responsible desperately needed no one else to see. The condition of the other driver, the smell of alcohol, the laboratory samples, and if that doctor had disappeared so suddenly and so completely afterward, perhaps he hadn't abandoned her at all. Or rather, perhaps abandoning her hadn't been the whole story. Perhaps someone had made him disappear. The tragedy she'd carried for 4 years as though it were nothing more than a private humiliation might actually have been one small link in a far larger machine built to conceal the crimes of a powerful family. Ronan didn't speak that suspicion aloud that night. It wasn't yet time. He only held her a little tighter, and Tessa, resting her face against the shoulder of the man she'd come to love, suddenly realized that the sound she'd spent years waiting for, the quiet click of a door gently closing whenever someone saw her wheelchair, was nowhere to be heard. Instead, for the very first time, she heard something entirely different. She heard the sound of a door slowly opening. That winter passed over the two of them. Through days so ordinary they became extraordinary. There were dinners where he painstakingly learned to cook the stew from her mother's old recipe, though every batch somehow came out just a little too salty. There were quiet afternoons when he sat at one end of the table reading reports, while she painted, two entirely different kinds of paperwork lying side by side beneath the same pool of golden lamplight. There were evenings when Micah dragged him away to ask for help with mechanical engineering assignments, and slowly discovered that this man who supposedly worked in transportation knew far more about machinery than anyone reasonably should. Yet it was during those uneventful days, the days that seemed to hold nothing worth telling, that Tessa stumbled upon the moments she would remember for the rest of her life. The first came one afternoon at his house. She reached toward his desk for a notepad so she could leave him a message, but accidentally picked up a leather-bound notebook tucked deep inside the drawer instead. She opened it, intending only to tear out a blank page, then remained perfectly still for a very long time. It wasn't a work notebook at all. It was a school notebook in the truest sense. Every page was filled with Ronan's neat, firm handwriting. There were underlined passages, highlighted notes, entire paragraphs copied over again and again. He'd written about the safest angle for wheelchair ramps, about the proper height for countertops within comfortable reach from a seated position, about how to help someone transfer from a wheelchair to another chair in a way that allowed them, not the helper, to stay in control. There was an entire section labeled things never to do. Never push someone's wheelchair without being asked. Never crouch down and speak as though talking to a child. Never praise someone for being inspirational as though simply living were an achievement. Across the very first page, written larger than anything else, and enclosed inside a thick hand-drawn border, were only 3 words. Always ask first. Tessa turned each page with fingers that had begun to tremble. She imagined the man the entire city feared, sitting alone late at night, after finishing reports and making decisions heavy enough to change lives, keeping a lamp burning while studying how to love a woman in a wheelchair, the way someone studies an exact science, patiently, humbly, writing down every mistake so he wouldn't repeat it. She quietly closed the notebook, placed it back exactly where she'd found it, and never told him she'd seen it. From that day forward, every time he asked, "What would you like me to do?" she heard those words with entirely different ears. The second moment arrived near the end of winter when he invited her and Micah to dinner at his house. The instant she crossed the doorway, Tessa knew something had changed. Not the obvious sort of change that came from new furniture or expensive renovations, but the kind only someone sitting at her height could ever notice. The raised thresholds between rooms had disappeared, replaced by perfectly level floors. The spaces between tables and chairs had been widened just enough for a wheelchair to turn comfortably. The light switches had been lowered until they rested within easy reach of her hand. Then there was the kitchen. That magnificent kitchen, which had once seemed as impossibly tall as the counter in a luxury hotel, now included an entire lowered section of countertop, with open space beneath it for a wheelchair to roll comfortably underneath. There was a single lever faucet, drawers that glided open with almost no effort. Every alteration had been carried out with such quiet elegance that it blended seamlessly into the rest of the house. Nothing looked modified. Nothing suggested accommodation. When she turned toward him, unable to find any words at all, he merely shrugged and answered lightly, "A home should fit the people who live in it. It doesn't make much sense expecting people to fit the house instead." Then he quickly wandered off to check the oven, as though trying to escape the moment altogether. But Tessa had already understood. This man hadn't built her a beautiful cage wrapped in kindness. He'd quietly removed one brick after another, from the walls surrounding his own world, until her life could roll into it as naturally as coming home. She never thanked him. She knew he neither needed nor wanted those words. Instead, over the following weeks, she quietly created the third gift, one belonging entirely to her. On the nights he believed she was simply painting commissioned illustrations, she painted him instead. The painting was finished on the first warm, sunny day of early spring. Wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with rough twine, she left it upon his desk. When Ronan opened the package, he stood motionless for so long that Connor knocked twice without receiving an answer. The painting showed that rainy afternoon at the Larkspur from behind Tessa's own point of view. A broad-shouldered man wearing a dark coat knelt on one knee beside a wheelchair, his head slightly bowed, one hand resting gently upon a tiny loose bolt. The restaurant around them dissolved into soft gray washes of rain, yet the small space between those two people glowed with a warm honey-colored light, a light that came from no lamp anywhere within the painting itself. In the lower corner, where an artist normally signed her name, she'd written only one quiet line in delicate brushstrokes. The day the light stayed on. Ronan hung the painting inside the office overlooking the harbor, directly opposite his desk. From that day forward, whenever another sleepless night found him surrounded by the heaviest decisions of his life, the first thing he saw when he lifted his eyes was no longer the darkness stretching across the city. It was the afternoon he'd knelt beside a wheelchair, and the moment an entirely different life had quietly opened its door and invited him. Inside, spring arrived hand in hand with a storm, and that storm crashed into their lives from two different directions during the very same week. The first came in the form of a file the legal team placed upon Ronan's desk. The largest transaction in his entire plan to move the Gallagher empire into legitimate business, the sale of a major warehouse complex to one of the country's most respected investment funds, had reached the final stage before signing. Among the names of the representatives flying into Boston for the ceremony, one name held his attention for a very long time: Wade Corbin, the privileged son of a powerful political family, the director of strategic partnerships for the investment fund. To anyone else, it would have been nothing more than black ink on white paper. But Ronan had heard that name once before, from Tessa herself, on the night she'd finally spoken about the afternoon that had stolen far more from her than the use of her legs. Until that moment, he'd never had a reason to look into the Corbin family. That very night, he quietly ordered his people to dig through every corner of Wade Corbin's past, thoroughly and without drawing attention. What they uncovered over the following days made Ronan's hand tighten around the edge of his wooden desk. The accident report from that night contained strange omissions. A personal driver had stepped forward to accept responsibility in exchange for an inexplicably generous settlement. Laboratory samples had been officially listed as lost. A resident physician had resigned without warning before leaving the state only a short time afterward. Every piece aligned into one unmistakable line leading toward a single truth. The man who had shattered the life of the woman Ronan loved had never paid for what he'd done, not for a single day. Now fate had placed that very man across the signing table from him, close enough to reach, so close that, with nothing more than a single nod delivered according to the rules of Ronan's old world, Wade Corbin could disappear, without leaving behind the slightest trace. The second sight of the storm arrived late on the weekend night, not from an enemy, but from the man Ronan trusted more than anyone else. Connor knocked on the office door very late, and the moment it closed behind him, the salt and pepper-haired man, who had served 2 generations of the Gallagher family, did something Ronan had never witnessed in all those years. Connor dropped to his knees. His voice shattered as he confessed. His daughter, the grown woman who'd lived in another city her entire life, because he'd hidden her away from the darkness surrounding his own, had been taken by Doyle's people not long after the warehouse meeting. They'd sent him a photograph and a phone. From that day forward, he'd answered every question they asked. Ronan's schedule, business dealings, and even her, the woman in South Boston. His voice broke completely there. He knew, he said, that by the laws of their world he deserved death. He wasn't asking for mercy. He asked only one thing: save his daughter first, then punish him afterward. She knew nothing about the world her father belonged to. She was innocent. Ronan stood perfectly still, looking at the man who'd once carried him as a child, now kneeling with his head bowed to the floor. Rage and heartbreak twisted together into something cold enough to freeze the air itself, because in that single instant, he understood Doyle had never truly retreated after the warehouse confrontation. He had merely changed the game. He'd found Connor's weakness and used it to pierce the innermost circle around Ronan, which meant he'd almost certainly discovered Ronan's own weakness as well, the woman living inside that little ground-floor apartment. Doyle closing in from the darkness, Corbin closing in from the daylight, 2 jaws of the same trap slowly tightening around the people Ronan loved. He helped Connor back to his feet and spoke only a few words. "Your daughter is coming home. We'll deal with the rest afterward." Then he spent the entire night sitting alone before the painting titled "The Day the Light Stayed On." Inside his mind stretched 2 completely different roads. The old road, fast, efficient by the standards of darkness, one order for Doyle to disappear, one carefully arranged accident for Wade Corbin. Every threat extinguished before another week had passed. Then there was the new road, slow, dangerous, one that exposed Ronan himself to the law, yet it was also the only road with light waiting at the end. The following afternoon he carried both roads to Tessa. He told her everything. About Wade's role in the upcoming business deal, about everything his investigation had uncovered from the night of her accident, about Connor and his kidnapped daughter, about the 2 choices tearing him apart. Then he said quietly, "If you only nod your head, the man who destroyed your life will pay before this week is over. No courtroom will ever need to convene." Tessa sat in silence for a very long time, looking down at the hands she'd once soaked in ice water night after night. Finally she lifted her eyes. They were red with tears, but her voice was as steady as bedrock. She spoke the words that would determine everything that followed. "Listen to me. If you punish him that way, then he wins, because he'll have turned you into exactly what he is, someone who believes he's above the laws that govern everyone else. And then your mother will lose not only her husband, but her son to the very same darkness. I don't need revenge, Ronan. I've lived in this wheelchair for 4 years, and what I need isn't one more broken man. What I need is to see justice with my own eyes just once in my life. Even if it's slow, even if it's difficult, let me see that justice exists. Save Connor's daughter with the man you've become, not with the hands you used to have." Then she reached across, took his hand firmly inside both of hers, and squeezed it tight. "As for me, I'll stay beside you on that slower road." All the way to the end, the plan to rescue Connor's daughter began in absolute silence. Just as he'd promised, Ronan relied on a cool head instead of old instincts. A staged exchange was carefully arranged to lure Doyle's men into revealing their location. The place where Connor's daughter was being held was confirmed, and while waiting for the right moment to move, Ronan kept every part of his routine unchanged, so nothing would alert the enemy, including the Saturday afternoon date when he took Tessa to see a place he said was still being renovated for a surprise. It was during that seemingly harmless afternoon that Doyle chose to strike, because the old fox understood something Connor had unknowingly taught him. If you want to bring down a man made of steel, wait until he's standing beside the softest part of his heart, an empty parking lot behind the building, long afternoon shadows stretching across the pavement. Ronan was opening the car door for her. Then he saw it. He didn't hear it. He saw it, a tiny flash of reflected light on the rooftop of the building across the street, where there should have been nothing except pigeons. Half a second. His entire life narrowed into that single half second. He knew exactly what that flash was. He knew the rifle was aimed at him, at the man standing in Doyle's way, not at the woman sitting low behind the armored car door. He also knew exactly what he still had time to do. Drop behind the vehicle. Quick. Safe. The correct response drilled into him by a lifetime of survival. But if he ducked, the bullet would lose its target and search for another. The next angle would sweep through the opening beside the car door, the place where chestnut brown hair caught the afternoon light. So he didn't duck. Ronan Gallagher, the man who had spent his entire life calculating every possible move before making one, made his final decision with his heart instead of his mind. He turned, spread his shoulders wide, and transformed himself into a wall between the rifle and the woman he loved. Then the gunshot ripped the afternoon apart. Tessa heard the shot before she understood what had happened. Then she felt the weight of his body collapsing across hers. Tires screeched somewhere in the distance. Bodyguards shouted into their radios, and beneath it all she heard her own voice calling his name once, then again, while her hand touched his shoulder and found a terrifying warmth spreading rapidly beneath the fabric of his coat. In that instant, Tessa's world split cleanly into two halves. One half belonged to the woman silently screaming inside herself. The other half, the half she'd believed had died 4 years earlier, suddenly rose from the ashes, slipped back into a white hospital coat and took command. Pressure on the wound. Before conscious thought could even catch up, both her hands were already pressing a folded cloth firmly against his shoulder. Keep him awake. She spoke to him without stopping, her voice steady, calm, unwavering. Look at me. Breathe with me. Slowly now. The ambulance is coming. Assessment. Her eyes moved over the color of his lips, the rhythm of his breathing, the location of the bleeding, calculating through professional instincts that hadn't rusted despite lying dormant for so many years. And Ronan, through the haze slowly clouding his vision, still managed to witness the miracle unfolding before him. His woman in the wheelchair wasn't trembling. She was saving him. Her face was as calm as the surface of a still lake, and her gray eyes burned like twin beacons. He started to smile, trying to say something, but she interrupted him with a quiet scolding. Save your strength. You can talk later, and he obeyed without argument. For the first time in his life, someone dared scold the head of the Gallagher family, and the head of the Gallagher family answered with a smile. The ambulance arrived. Then came the hospital, white lights, hallways rushing past overhead. The surgery lasted until late that night. The bullet was removed from a place the chief surgeon later described with only one sentence. 2 finger widths lower, and tonight would have ended very differently. During the days that followed, the intensive care unit witnessed a sight people would talk about for years. Beside the bed of the most powerful man in the city stood not a wall of bodyguards, but a woman in a wheelchair who remained there day and night. She read every number flashing across the monitors faster than the nurses on duty. She adjusted his position according to textbook standards. She questioned the pain management protocol, using medical terminology that left the physicians quietly asking one another, "Who is she?" It was during those long nights spent watching over the breathing of the man she loved, listening to the monitor's steady rhythm echo like the heartbeat of the darkness itself, that Tessa finally understood something she'd misunderstood for 4 long years. The accident had taken her legs. It had taken the tiny life growing inside her, but it had never taken away the nurse within her. That woman had merely sat down. She had never truly left. Her worth had never been measured by legs capable of standing inside an emergency room. It lived in these hands, in this mind, in this heart, all of them remained untouched. And tonight they had saved the most precious life she had left in the world. When Ronan fully regained consciousness one sunny morning, the first thing he said, his voice still rough from the breathing tube, was, "Do you know something? I saw you working. I've never seen anyone stronger than you." Tessa simply lowered her forehead until it rested gently against his and let the tears fall without trying to stop them. The bullet that tore through Ronan's shoulder turned out to be Fergus Doyle's greatest mistake, because it transformed a man who had been walking slowly toward redemption into a man who no longer had anything left to hesitate over. Even from his hospital bed, his injured arm still suspended in a sling, Ronan summoned both his legal team and one guest the underworld would have never imagined the head of the Gallagher family would invite of his own free will, a relentless federal prosecutor known throughout the country for his integrity, a man who had spent years trying unsuccessfully to crack Doyle's carefully constructed empire. The negotiations stretched across several long meetings behind closed doors. Placed upon the table was a cooperation agreement unlike anything the city had ever witnessed. Ronan surrendered everything the Gallagher organization possessed concerning Doyle's operation, the predatory lending network, the financial trails, the contracts buried beneath microscopic print, the money laundering fronts, the names of every lieutenant carrying out Doyle's orders, together with evidence surrounding Connor's daughter's kidnapping and the attempted assassination in the parking lot. In return, the legalization of Ronan's own businesses would proceed under official federal supervision instead of being dismantled through criminal prosecution. Every shipping yard, every warehouse, every company brought into legitimate business would carry the formal seal of the law. Ronan accepted the harshest condition of all: regular reporting, complete financial transparency, opening every ledger, walking a tightrope suspended between two worlds, one side occupied by law enforcement waiting for the slightest misstep, the other by the underworld viewing cooperation with federal prosecutors as an unforgivable betrayal. Connor asked him one day, his voice heavy with emotion, "Do you realize you're gambling with your own life?" Ronan looked quietly toward the painting titled "The Day the Light Stayed," on hanging opposite his desk before answering. "I've spent my whole life betting on darkness. Just this once, let me place my wager on the light." The operation began at dawn on an early summer morning. Simultaneous, precise, lightning fast. Connor's daughter was safely rescued from a house in the suburbs before her captors even understood what was happening. Fergus Doyle was handcuffed at his own breakfast table. Images of the city's most feared loan shark lowering his head as officers guided him into a police vehicle dominated every news broadcast that day, accompanied by a list of criminal charges so lengthy the anchor had to turn to a second page before finishing. Yet for Tessa, the true earthquake lay elsewhere within the investigation. While tracing Doyle's financial network, federal investigators uncovered old transactions leading directly to the Corbin Family Foundation. From that discovery, together with the files Ronan had surrendered concerning the accident, years earlier, the missing portions of the original police report, the vanished laboratory samples, the suspiciously generous payment to the driver who'd accepted responsibility, and the sudden disappearance of the resident physician who'd fled the state, the prosecutor's office formally ordered a complete reopening of the investigation into Tessa's accident. It was a case that had never actually reached a courtroom because it had been buried long before then, meaning no legal door had ever truly been closed. The young physician from that night was eventually located in a distant town. He broke down in tears while giving his statement, describing how he'd been threatened and bribed into disappearing. One sentence from his testimony was entered into the official record. "For all these years I've been living like a dead man drifting downstream. You arrived late, but at least you finally arrived." The day Tessa was invited to testify as the victim, silence settled across the courthouse hallway as her wheelchair rolled toward the courtroom. Wade Corbin sat on the opposite side, surrounded by an army of expensive attorneys, still wearing the confident expression of a man who had never faced real consequences in his entire life. That confidence lasted only until Tessa began to speak. She carried no prepared statement, only the calm, steady voice of someone who had rehearsed this moment through 4 long years of living. She described that afternoon with the precise clarity of a witness, rather than the broken sorrow of a victim. She named everything she'd lost using simple facts instead of bitter accusations. Then, near the end, she turned completely toward Wade. For the first time in all those years, she looked directly into his eyes and spoke words that left the entire courtroom holding its breath. "You took my legs. You took the little life growing inside me before that child ever had the chance to be born. You took the man I believed I'd spend my future with. You took my faith in kindness itself. But I didn't come here today to demand those things back. No one could ever return them. I came here to say that I forgive you, not because you deserve forgiveness. You never even asked for it. I forgive you because I deserve it. I deserve to lay this burden down after carrying it on my back for 4 years. Forgiveness is something I do for myself." Then she turned toward the judges. "Justice is something I trust you to do for every person who never had someone standing behind them the way I eventually did. The rest of his life, I leave in the hands of the law." She stepped away from this witness stand into a silence that seemed to stretch forever. Then, from the last row of the courtroom, people watched as the first person to rise to his feet was a man whose injured arm still rested in a sling. He didn't applaud. He simply stood there, shoulders straight, the way people stand in the presence of something greater than themselves. Nearly a year later, when the first cold rains of the season returned to the city, once again, Boston had become a slightly different place. Fergus Doyle and the machinery of his empire were counting down the days behind bars while awaiting trial. The investigation into the Corbijn family tightened week by week as one prominent name after another was summoned to testify. And for the first time in 3 generations, the Gallagher name appeared across newspaper headlines, without police cars in the accompanying photographs. There were stories about the officially supervised transfer of the Eastern Harbor complex to its new joint venture. There were reports announcing that Gallagher Transportation had publicly listed the first divisions of its legitimate businesses. The journey toward legitimacy wasn't finished yet, but it had passed the point where there was no turning back. Hidden among those articles was one small announcement that almost no one noticed. Yet it brought tears to the eyes of 2 people. A scholarship fund had been established in memory of a woman who had long since passed away, created for financially struggling students who were themselves victims of traffic accidents or family members of accident victims. At the very top of the first list of scholarship recipients, printed in bold letters, stood the name Micah Monroe, Engineering Department. The young college student remained standing before the announcement board on campus for a very long time before taking a photograph and sending it to his sister with a message that read, "Tessa, from now on, I'll be going to school with money from a grandmother I never had the chance to meet, and I'm going to study hard enough to make her proud." Then came that Friday afternoon when Ronan told Tessa, "I'd like to show you the surprise that was still under construction before. It's finally finished now." Their car wound through familiar streets before stopping at an address that made her heart catch for a single beat. The Larkspur, the restaurant where their anonymous first date had taken place. Yet this was a completely transformed Larkspur. Beneath the restaurant's wooden sign, another smaller line had been carved into the wood. A place where every path is open. When the wide entrance door swung open without a single step blocking the way, Tessa rolled inside and instantly understood what she was standing in. Ronan had purchased the entire restaurant, then rebuilt it into a place where she and everyone like her could come exactly as everyone else did. The pathways between the tables were wide enough for a wheelchair to turn comfortably. Tables of different heights blended naturally together, as though they'd always been designed that way. Gentle ramps replaced every change in floor level. The bar included a lowered section within easy reach, and that afternoon every member of the staff greeted her by looking directly into her eyes instead of down at her wheelchair. She rolled through that beautiful space with tears stinging her nose, because this wasn't a gift created only for her. It was a declaration built from wood and stone, declaring that the world could absolutely be designed to include everyone, if only someone was willing to begin. The little corner table from that rainy afternoon remained exactly where it had always been, preserved like a treasured cornerstone. When she stopped beside it, Ronan didn't sit across from her. Instead, he walked around the table, and before her eyes, before Bridget and Micah, who somehow had been standing quietly in the corner all along with tear-filled eyes, He lowered one knee to the floor beside her wheelchair in exactly the same position he'd taken that rainy afternoon long ago. Only this time he wasn't holding a wrench. Instead, he carried a small wooden box. He opened the lid. Resting upon dark velvet lay a simple ring, glowing with quiet elegance. Beside it, displayed with exactly the same reverence, lay an old tarnished bolt. "Do you remember it?" he asked, his voice low and unhurried. "The bolt I tightened for you the first day we met. I asked your permission to keep it when I replaced it with a new one. And today, I have to confess something I've kept hidden from you for almost a year." He smiled shyly. "That afternoon, nothing about it was actually an accident. Bridget had kept me completely in the dark, wanting to see how I would react when I saw you. But the moment you rolled through that door, I didn't see an obstacle. I saw a woman who took my breath away. And because my life has forced me to notice every shifting detail in a room to survive, my eyes instantly caught the slight wobble in your front wheel and how you leaned to balance it. I didn't know anything about wheelchairs, but I knew machinery, and I knew a loose bolt when I saw one. Kneeling down wasn't a calculated move to impress you. It was the only way I knew how to quiet my own racing heart, by focusing on something I could actually fix for you right then and there. I wanted that if there was ever something in your world that needed a helping hand, my hand would simply know how to be useful to you, without pity and without hesitation." Before he'd even finished speaking, a sound escaped Tessa that was somewhere between laughter and a sob. The moment that had breathed life back into her heart all those months before hadn't been a miracle falling from the sky after all. It had been something a nervous, awkward man had carefully prepared through countless anxious nights. And somehow, dear God, that was infinitely more precious than any miracle could ever have been. So when he lifted the ring, took a deep breath, and had barely managed to begin, "Tessa Monroe, will you?" She was already leaning forward, wrapping both arms around his neck. Her whispered, "Yes," dissolved into tears against his shoulder before he'd even finished asking the question, while applause burst through the restaurant behind them. Two younger siblings stood there crying, one weeping from overwhelming happiness, the other because a debt of gratitude carried for so many years had finally been repaid in a way more beautiful than any dream could ever have imagined. The wedding was planned for the spring, but the moment that little family would remember forever arrived much sooner, on an ordinary Sunday morning that no one had prepared for. The four of them had arranged to take a walk through Franklin Park. Bridget and Ronan were several steps ahead, happily arguing over the wedding menu, while Micah walked beside his sister's wheelchair the way he had ever since he was a little boy. Early spring sunlight spilled golden across the gravel path. Then they reached the gentle hill, the very same slope where the two siblings had once raced each other to the top. Micah suddenly slowed to a stop. He stood in silence for a long moment before speaking, his voice calm, every word perfectly clear. "Tessa, you're in a wheelchair. This hill is a little long. Let me push you up." Tessa froze in the middle of the path and slowly looked up at her brother. Because after all these years, this was the first time those words had ever been spoken. Not another question about going for a run. Not another gentle lie wrapped inside tomorrow. This was simply the truth, spoken by her brother himself as naturally as someone commenting on the weather. Micah met her eyes and smiled softly before continuing the secret he'd carried alone for so long. "Don't look so surprised. My memory really does have holes in it. The doctors were right. Some mornings I wake up and everything is completely confused. But on the days when I do remember everything, every single detail, I was still a coward, Tessa. I kept bringing up those old running memories and joking about the hill, because it was the only way I could escape the guilt. I hid inside the past because I couldn't bear looking directly at the truth, terrified that admitting I was the reason you had to sit down would break us both. But today, I don't want to hide anymore. I watched Ronan kneel in front of everyone and admit every one of his mistakes. I watched you stand in court and forgive the man who destroyed your life. The two of you taught me something. A strong person isn't someone who never breaks. A strong person is someone who has the courage to stand beside their broken places. So today, I want to start learning how to become strong too. You're in a wheelchair. That's the truth. I love you. That's also the truth. And those two truths can stand beside each other. Neither one has to hide the other." Then he quietly walked behind her wheelchair, rested both hands upon the handles, and asked gently, "May I push you now?" Tears were already streaming across Tessa's smiling face. She could only nod, unable to force a single word past the tightness in her throat, allowing her little brother to push her all the way to the top of the sunlit hill, where Ronan and Bridget stood waiting. Looking up from below, anyone watching would have seen 4 figures silhouetted against the bright spring sky, a family pieced back together from fragments that had once been shattered, every seam where those broken pieces met now glowing with quiet light. Ronan Gallagher spent 33 years watching people shrink into themselves whenever he entered a room. Yet the most powerful man in Boston didn't truly become strong until the rainy afternoon he lowered one knee to the floor of a quiet restaurant, tightened one tiny bolt, and chose to stay. And Tessa, the woman who had spent so many years waiting to hear another door quietly close behind her, finally understood the lesson fate had taken so long to teach her. Some people enter our lives not to switch on the light, but simply to sit beside us in the darkness until the darkness itself is no longer frightening, and by doing that, they become the light. This story may have reached its end, but it leaves behind one simple truth for every one of us. A person's worth is never measured by legs strong enough to stand, or by a powerful family name. It is measured by the way we treat one another during our weakest moments. Respecting someone means asking what they need instead of deciding for them. Loving someone means learning their world with your whole heart. And forgiveness, whether offered to another person or to yourself, has never been weakness. It is the bravest thing an injured heart can ever choose to do. If you believe in those truths, please leave the word light in the comments as a message to someone out there who may still be sitting alone inside their own darkness. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it so we can continue bringing meaningful stories to more people every day. We'd also love to hear what you thought about Tessa and Ronan's journey. Which moment touched your heart the most? We truly look forward to reading your thoughts. Thank you sincerely for staying with us until these final words. We wish you and your family good health, lasting happiness, and peace every single day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.